Hello, hello. Welcome back to Angular Nation. I'm very excited tonight. Very excited. We have really maybe my most favorite guests. We have Misko and Shai, and we're going to get into some Qwik tonight. First, I want to give a quick shout out to AG Grid, and thank you so much, AG Grid, for helping us keep Angular Nation going. We love AG Grid. Okay, so tonight I have asked Misko to come and show us this new cool thing called Qwik, and he's going to. But first, I have a couple of questions, and I want to introduce Misko Hevery, the father of Angular. How are you doing, Misko?
I'm doing well. How's it going over there?
So good to see you. It's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in forever. And we're going to keep him in the back pocket for a minute, but we're going to get to him. But I just want everybody to say hello. We got Shai Reznik in the house.
Booyah, Kasha. What's up, everybody?
So I want Misko for a minute to talk to us about what was so important for you, because this was kind of a big deal. Like, I was shocked for you to leave the Angular team at the height of its popularity. I want you to help us understand that decision.
Well, I mean, have you done anything for 16 years? You know, like after 16 years of doing something, like you kind of owe it to yourself to go and try something new, right? To explore the world and find out. Like 16 years is like a freaking teenager.
Angular is a teenager.
Yeah, like literally. So, you know, I kind of felt like I was doing the same thing day in and day out. Not that I wasn't, I mean, I think I was good at it, etc. But I wanted to really just try new things after 16 years. Like, you just have to see what else is out there, what else you can try. And so my motivation was mainly from, you know, just exploring the world. Like I always told myself I was going to stay at Google for like 5-6 years or something and then move on. But yeah, I was about 10 years too late. But I think, you know, most people, when you look at the resume, you'll see that, you know, people stay at places for 3-4 years kind of is a good stretch, right? And so 16 years is 4 to 5 times that much. And so I think it was just time. You know, there was no like secondary reasons other than I was either going to move or I was going to retire over there. So one or the other.
I remember you telling me, like, there's so much responsibility because so many people are using Angular that there's so much responsibility that it always has to be, everything has to, you know, and you just wanted to have like the freedom to go a little crazy and break things. And
yeah, so there's the freedom of that. But there's also like freedom of learning, right? Like when you move to a new place and a new project and a new thing, like you're learning a whole bunch of things that you didn't know about before, and you know it's exciting, it's new, it's you know it's also good growth for yourself, right?
So you kind of, when you left, you kind of knew what you were going to do next.
Yeah, so I joined a startup. I always told myself I wanted to do a startup. And really, this is kind of the only time I can do a startup, right? Like it's either now or like never, because like my oldest kid is 12 and he's going to go to college soon. I need to pay for it and all kinds of stuff like that, right? So like there's this short window of opportunity which I have to give this a try and see if it works out. So far, it's going great. Or really never. And so I took a deep breath and did a huge jump. It's very, very different.
So yeah, which brings me to my next question, because Qwik is, you told me, completely different than what we're used to looking at.
Yeah.
Why are you? Shai needs to make you another T-shirt. Why are you doing this to us, Misko?
I have a better question. Why am I doing this to myself?
Right.
That's a lot better question than why am I doing it to you? So it's a complicated answer. Google has this framework internally called Wiz, and Wiz has some interesting properties. Mainly Wiz is used behind Gmail, Photos, and the most important one, Google Search. And I don't know if you noticed, Google Search is fast.
We noticed.
And you might think that it's like, oh, it's just a simple form that's static content. Not so much. Have you like typed an equation or a movie into Google Search, or like weather or like anything like fancy like that, you'll get complicated graphs and charts and calculators and all kinds of stuff. So there's actually a lot of interactivity and behavior, even though it looks simple. And so something like Google search could never be built with Angular, React, Vue, or any of the standard frameworks. And so Google has a special thing called Wiz. And Wiz has this idea of resumability, of like server-side pre-rendering, and then just continuing where the server left off. But Wiz is super complicated, and there is no way that Google is ever going to make it open source, mainly because like it is so fundamentally tied to how Google internally works. It's not that they don't want to, like they would love to, but like nobody's going to go through the effort to make it open sourced. And even if they did, like it doesn't really fit the open source ecosystem. It's very, very different. It's a strange thing, but it has this interesting property, which is that it is resumable. Resumable is actually a term that I coined. They don't call it resumable, but like I think of it in terms of its resumability. And I always thought like, the outside world needs something like this. Like there's this whole history of Google inventing insane technologies, right? And then the outside rebuilds it. Like Google has Bigtable, and then I think and then it has MapReduce and all these things, and the outside world kind of rebuilds it as Hadoop and a few other things, right? And so I think this is just one of those things where you look at this and you go like, damn, this is just such a good idea, and the outside world just doesn't have any tools to do this, right? And so back in the day, like back in like 2019, I actually gave a talk in NGConf where I talked about like, hey, like we need resumability, we need like a way, like how do you rethink how applications work? Like, could you like do something better? Could you have a better, faster startup performance? And so the idea kind of started there, and I gave it to everybody in the world, but everybody just kind of politely listened and nodded their head, and like nothing happened, right? The world didn't really,
because it looks completely different.
It looks completely different, and it's like one of those things where like you can express, like people always think like everybody, if you're gonna share your idea, people will steal your idea, and I find the exact opposite to be the case. Like if you have an idea and you want somebody to like work on it, you usually have to like really beat on them for like a long time before they're like even willing to do anything on the particular
because
topic.
Your brain is light years ahead, Misko.
It's not that. It's just that people just, people are always afraid that somebody else is going to steal your idea. I find that it's the exact opposite. Like you really have to work on people for a long time before they're like, oh, I get it. Like I see how it's different and I see why it's valuable and so on and so forth. Anyways, so I gave that talk and nothing happened. And so the years passed by, and then at some point I was like, I just had this need of like, I felt guilty. I said, like I could go and retire and do something else, and then the world would not have this technology. And I didn't see any inklings that that's the direction we're even heading towards. And so I kind of told myself, like, what would it take to kind of rebuild this externally? And along the way, one of the things I really wanted to make sure is that it had a beautiful developer experience, right? Because Wiz developer experience is just horrendous. Like, Google can get away with it because they have tons of money and they can just throw, hundreds of people at the problem. But this is not like what would fly externally. Like externally, there's no way that you could use something like Wiz and people would laugh at it. And so there was a huge amount of innovation that actually that had to happen in the Qwik before like it was even palatable. Remember I showed the first prototype to Shai, and Shai was like, "Oh, that's interesting, but it's ugly as hell. Why would anybody want to use this?"
True. Right.
Well,
and so it took a while, right? It took a lot of innovation, a lot of creative way of looking at the problem before it actually got to the state where it's actually friendly. Anyway, so that's kind of the background behind it. Does that make sense, or am I just blabbering?
And so I definitely understand the reason for having this like completely different thing, but it's a little challenging because it is for teaching it, because it just looks so completely different than anything that we're used to. But there's a reason.
Well, it doesn't really look that different. Like it looks kind of like React, and it's kind
just
of
a different way of thinking.
It's more like a different way of thinking rather than it like the crazy thing about it is that it surprisingly at first glance, you look at this and you go like, oh, it's just like React. And
so you were talking about teaching and how to get people to wrap their head around this.
Yeah, so that's kind of the problem, right? So when people are like looking at it and they're like, oh, does the world need another framework? And the answer is yes and no, right? So the answer is no. The world doesn't need yet another of the same kind of framework, right? So the world doesn't need another Angular, another Vue, another React, another Svelte, right? If you look at all these frameworks, they're different in essentially the syntax, right? The way you express yourself as a developer, but they work the same way. Like all of them work the same way. And because they work the same way, they are pretty much the same thing, right? Like at this point, I don't think it makes any sense to just make yet another one of these client-side frameworks. Like what exactly would you innovate on? Like it's kind of all been tried. So the value add of Qwik isn't that the way it looks or the way you use it, because Qwik is actually very similar to React in that sense. The value is that Qwik can do things that the other frameworks cannot do, right?
And that's very important.
Right, and that's kind of the kind of mental shift, right? Which is that if you choose any of the existing frameworks, they're all about the same in terms of what they can do and how they do it. And so once you know one, really it's just syntax to learn the other one, and you kind of know everything. But when you come to Qwik, it's just like a very different approach. And one thing I like to talk about is how existing frameworks have these blinders on, right? And they kind of look like this, and they say, what is my problem? And they say, my problem is rendering on the client, right? And that's kind of the way people think about it. They're like, oh yeah, that's my problem. Like the purpose of a framework is to have a rendering on the client. And the thing that's different about Qwik is that Qwik says, okay, instead of my problem being rendering in the client, have these kind of a myopic box in which you look into. Qwik looks at it in a much more kind of a holistic way and says, actually, the problem isn't rendering on the client. The problem is the whole thing, which starts at the server, rendering, serialization, SSR, sending it to the client, resuming it, restoring the state, bundling, breaking everything up into files, and so on and so forth, right? So the thing that's different about Qwik is that it says like my problem space, the thing I am attempting to solve, is the whole thing, rather than being very myopic about it and saying it's just this little box that I care about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but hold on, because if I let you, you'll deep dive and fry our brains, and you're going to show us in a minute. So
yes,
pause there.
Okay.
Because I had one more question for you, but I actually have two questions because I'm going to squeeze in an extra question. I asked you this question about a year ago, and you probably don't remember, but it was right when you left the Angular team, and I was worried because I'm running Angular Nation, and I'm like, Misko, because you were telling me about Qwik, and I was starting to realize like this could actually be really, cool and innovative, and if it takes off, does that mean Angular is going to go away? Tell me now before I spend all this.
No, I mean,
so
I don't think Angular is going to go away. So first of all, like 2/3 of internal Google applications, which is something like 2,000 apps or something like that, run on top of Angular, right? So Google couldn't get rid of Angular even if it tried, right? Because they would literally break themselves. And 2/3 of apps being broken within a company, that's a significant thing that you can't just change things, right? So all of these frameworks, Angular, React, Vue, etc., they're going to be here for a long time. They're not really going anywhere. But they are running into a problem, right? And the problem is that let me actually show you the problem. The problem is
now it's deep diving. You see what you did there,
yeah, because we have one more question, and then you're supposed to share your screen, Misko.
I'm just gonna show you a video, okay? Where's the share button?
Wait, but okay. I would give a context before the video.
Yeah.
If I were you.
Okay, well, because I want to ask the very last question is about Shai.
You want to show the video. I want to show the video.
I want to show the video. Let me show the video, and then you can say. So here's the video. What's this? Okay, hold on. This is the video. These are the same exact website running in the existing technology and using Qwik. And you can see the ridiculous difference in what the output is.
Very proud of
I'm going to show it again, right?
On the right is Qwik. On the
The right
left
is Qwik. And what you need to look at is the color change, right? When the color goes gray, that means it's finished. When the left-hand side, when the color, it looks like it rendered, but it's not finished. And so it just keeps running for a long time before it actually goes gray. And so we're talking about 8.1 seconds versus 1.9 seconds, which is humongous difference.
But
That is huge.
okay, but I think again, first of all, this is super cool. And when the first time I saw it, I was like blown away. But I think the context here matters because people can say, okay, what is happening? In this 1.9 second, like what exactly is happening here, right? And
Yes.
That's what we're gonna show. But okay, Misko, can you take this down? Because I have one last question for you.
Okay.
And it's just so hard to just. But then I'm just gonna turn you two loose, right? And it's gonna be great. Last question. Because it doesn't look completely different, but it's kind of a new way for us to think about things, and it's a little bit hard because you said it's going to be kind of hard for some people to wrap their heads around it. So I think it was a great decision. I absolutely am so happy about this. What made you decide to ask Shai Reznik for help?
It was kind of a coincidence, I feel like. Like I was traveling to Europe and doing talks, and Shai was like, "Oh, I should come visit Israel." I was like, "You know what? I'm going to be in Barcelona, which is just a short hop from Israel. Why not? Why not just come?" And so I came over. We started chatting, and I showed what I was working on. And I think one thing led to the other, and people just get excited because they see the potential of like this is a fundamentally different way of solving the problem, and because of that. It's exciting. Shai, maybe you can tell your side of the story.
Okay, so it was a
coincidence?
It was a cold.
Because Misko said this would be hard to teach, and then he got the best teacher like in the universe.
No, it was a coincidence because he didn't like call me and said like, "Hey, Shai, I need your help" or something like that, right? It was. I called Misko to give a talk about Qwik in my meetup group called JavaScript Israel, and he gave a virtual lecture, remote lecture about Qwik, and people got excited. And then afterwards, we talked, me and him, and I had a few ideas on how to, I don't market it or how to, explain stuff or stuff that I saw in the lecture that I thought like to give tips as a friend to a friend. And then we talked about courses and that there needs to be a course about the framework.
Like, can we have the announcement now?
As part of the checklist.
Is this the moment?
I'm getting there.
Oh, sorry.
And and we're getting married. No, and. So we talked about, we both proposed. It was like a mutual, we both thought about it in the same time.
You both pulled out the ring at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Surprised each other. So we talked about courses, and I told him like, hey, I have this cool like new way to do courses. And he said like, hey, you want to do a course about Qwik? And I was like, yes. I thought it was meaning like, 1 year from now or something like that, when I will be done with all the testing courses and all the stuff that I'm doing. And he was like, yeah, what are you doing in June? I'm in Barcelona. And, I was like, I'm guessing doing a course with you. So then it became real, and I dug deeper into the framework and watched like 20 hours of like, lectures and interviews and all that stuff. And sat down with Misko for a couple of hours to ask him like to explain me all the details. And then it hit me the significance of what these guys did and like how it's opening up a new generation of web frameworks. Like we have Angular React, Vue, and such. Well, these are like generation 2. Generation 2.5 is like Next, Remix, that incorporate what Misko said that, that usually the client-side web frameworks are not like thinking about. So they started thinking about it, but trying to hack it in some way to make it work in terms of like rendering and then doing hydration to add all the event listeners. And
And it
then
sounds like what you were-
Mishko came with a whole other approach that he will show. And all of a sudden I got it like, okay, they even Remix and Next, which are like, Remix is like the new hot thing in the web framework world. They will need to change everything in order to catch up, and they will need to break their API, and it won't happen. We all know what it means to go and break the API of a framework, right? And change the entire ecosystem. But so they won't do it, right? And then I realized, okay, this is the future, because the future is going to a way of instant loading, instant interactivity. The war on SEO and speed time and core web vitals and all that stuff is happening, and that's why we see server-side rendering. That's why we see all these techniques. And Mishko just created a tool that gives competitive advantage to companies to reach this 100 page speed score. And so we see all the industry going to that way. And if we want to look into the future, not for the next, I don't know, 1 to 2 years, maybe in 2 years we'll have a whole other set of frameworks that are competing, and the old frameworks will stay with, the way I see it, the early adopters will be e-commerce websites, anything that is search engine facing, and then the rest of the industry will catch up. So we will have Angular and React and Vue for a long time in the B2B business, but the B2C will start the shift towards the new generation. And so when I got all this and we did the courses, Mishko came, we gave him the VIP treatment, we went to see Jerusalem and the Dead Sea and,
I
and
saw
all that fun
pictures.
stuff.
I was jealous.
Right. And he actually converted to Judaism, right, in the West, wall.
You got the hat too.
Yeah, he got the yarmulke and stuff. But anyway, so we did a workshop here with the top of the industry in Israel, and we explained the problem, and then he showed the solution, and everybody were like, whoa, this is the new, everybody said the same, this is the new generation of web frameworks. The top, Wix co-founder and core member core team member at Node, and top level people said the same thing. So I was like, okay, I felt like, okay, I'm really excited about this, and I think I have a way to explain it and get other people excited. Because I'm excited, I can spread it like I did back in the first AngularJS days, where I was excited about AngularJS. So we talked, me and Mishko, and I said, yeah, and I asked if they need help with DevRel work and such, spreading the word and bringing the community together and such. And I popped the ring, and he said yes, and we got married. So I'm the new DevRel for Qwik now.
Yay.
Okay.
This is a beautiful, beautiful relationship. Okay, so show us. Who's going to share the screen? Who's driving here?
All right, I'll share the screen.
Show us the rings.
Yeah.
Just to keep everybody relaxed. It's Reznik Hevery and not the other way. Okay. And no, but I'm still doing the testing courses. I'm still doing, it's not like I abandoned everything. I'm not I didn't take another a new job. I'm still doing the thing, but this is a thing I'm excited on for, and so that's why I'm helping and spreading the word.
So high res is not going away.
No,
Will
no.
the Qwik course be on high res?
Yes, it will be on high res, and I think to open a subcategory of Qwik School, and it be under Qwik School. So
Make sure and bring me an affiliate link.
sure, no problem.
All right, I'm going to go on mute, you guys. Teach us cool stuff.
So I think context matters. And so let's talk about like the problem space, or rather what problem that Qwik is solving that the other frameworks cannot solve, right? And so this is a graph of the amount of JavaScript we ship to the client. And as you can see, this graph just keeps going up. And there doesn't seem to be any reason for us to think that this is going to stop. And the reason why this is a problem is because all of this JavaScript has to get downloaded to the client and execute it before you can interact with your website, right? And that's kind of the crux of the problem, that the eager download and eager execution is what makes your application slow to start. And the thing is, if you think about it, all this code that's written inside of your app, like you don't need it all at once. And certainly you don't need it before you actually interact with the page, right? So like, you know, there's a lot of code because there is code for like adding if you take something like Amazon as an example, there's code for adding items to a shopping cart. There's code for commenting. There's codes for navigating to returning items or talking to the sellers, etc. Like there's a lot of features that exist in Amazon, but as a person, you can't use all the features all at once. Like it's impossible, right? So why are we in this world where we download all of the code all at once to the client, right? And that's kind of the crux of the problem, which is that our sites are getting more and more complicated, and we are shipping more and more JavaScript, and yet, we don't need all of this stuff all at once. And so the question becomes like, how do you slow down this growth? I want to jump over. Okay, so the reason why this is kind of, we keep talking about how this is a new generation of doing things. The top layer really represents how existing frameworks work, right? And so what you have here is that you have the server-side pre-rendered content. So if you remember, we had this thing. Oops. There we go. Right. So when I click here, the code, the text that shows up here, this is the server-side pre-rendered content, right? And so now it's colorful. It hasn't turned gray. And so from about 3 seconds for another 4.5 seconds, like what exactly is happening here until it goes gray? Like that's kind of the question. Like what's happening in here? And so what happened in there is this box right here, right? What we want is we want to have an interactive website, right? The server was able to send us HTML that showed up pretty quickly. We want to have an interactive website, but from here to here, we are talking about huge amount of work for the browser. And the huge amount of work is represented by this fat arrow, and this fat arrow really represents all of the previous graph, like all of the JavaScript that has to download, right? And in order to get the site interactive, really what it comes down to is that you have to register listeners, right? You have to say, like, if I click here, this is what happens. And if I click here, this is what happens, and so on and so forth, right? And so in order to get the interactivity, you have to figure out where the listeners are. And the way you figure out where the listeners are is you execute the application and you look at its templating output. And then from the template, you can determine where the listeners are. But in order to do that, you need to get the state of the application, right? And of course, you need to have the application. So what you see is like what you want is you just want your page to be interactive. But what you end up doing is as you pull on that string of like, okay, I need this interactivity. Like, where do I get the listeners? Oh, they're over here. How do I execute this? I need to have this. Where's the code? It's over here, right? You end up with like downloading the whole of your app essentially, or at least all of the stuff that's currently visible on the page, right? And this thing here takes all the time, and we call this particular style of doing things hydration. And hydration was like this cool term that people kept saying, like, oh, you have to hydrate the app in order to make it interactive. And I kind of wrote a blog post that basically said, actually, it's not a cool term. It's like a horrible workaround, and you shouldn't do this, right? And the horrible workaround is the fact that when the server generated your SSR, the server knew where the points of interactions were. The server knew the state of the app. The server knew how to, all the rendered information. The server had all the information necessary about the application, but it didn't serialize any of it. It threw everything away, right? All that information got thrown away, and only HTML got sent to the client. And then, of course, the HTML has insufficient amount of information to make the application work. And so to recover the information, you download the application again, and you re-execute it, which means you download everything twice, once as HTML, and then again as JavaScript. And then, of course, you have to re-execute, you have to redo everything the server just did. So another way of thinking about hydration is that it's replayable, right? It's a thing that the client has to replay or redo in order to get to the final state. So that's kind of the problem that we need to solve. And the solution is what we call resumable. And it turns out that there's a lot of things you need to do in order to be able to get here. So what we really want is the server gives us the HTML, but this time inside of the HTML, we have everything we need to reason about the application. And so we have this super tiny bootstrap, which is about 1 kilobyte, and it takes about a millisecond to execute. And you can think of this more as a polyfill that we install in a browser. And it's fixed. It never gets, no matter how complicated your application gets, it's always 1 kilobyte. And this allows you to bypass everything and go directly into the interactive state. So your application is interactive without downloading really any sort of JavaScript. Now, at some point you interact with it and you have a problem. Like if you just took this fat arrow here and moved it over here, you wouldn't have solved anything, right? Moving this arrow from here to there would mean that your first interaction would take, multiple seconds, which nobody would be happy with. And so the hard part, or the innovative part of Qwik, is Qwik knows how to take this fat arrow and break it up into teeny tiny pieces, so that when you interact with the page, only the code necessary for that interaction downloads to the client and executes. And this is kind of the magical bit, right? It's one of those things that's like completely obvious of like what should happen, but it turns out nobody knows how to do it. And in order to get here, in order to be able to do it, we had to come up with some pretty creative stuff. So that's kind of, yes.
So just to emphasize again, the problem of getting to, let's say, if you take your client-facing or B2C-facing app and take it to PageSpeed score and run it, it will show you a lower score because you're doing, other than not optimizing images and such, you're doing two things basically. You're downloading too much JavaScript, and you're executing initially too much JavaScript and blocking the main thread of the engine, and that's why you're getting lower points. So what Misko showed in the last slide with the fat arrow, this is the problem of the fat arrow. This is what it does. It downloads too much and it executes too much initially. What Qwik is doing is basically does zero of that, which is kind of crazy if you think about, I'm just rendering a page and there's zero JavaScript being executed initially. Okay, think about that. And only on first click, event, mouse over, whatever you care about that the user does, you then start, downloading. And, the next question probably is are you downloading too much or something like that? But I'm sure Misko will cover it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to show kind of this thing, which is that it doesn't matter which e-commerce, or it doesn't. I'm picking on e-commerce sites because that's what Builder does. But even if you ignore that for a second, if you look at it, most of the web has pathetic scores on Google PageSpeed, and even the big guys like Amazon, who totally understand the value of this and they have essentially endless resources, even they can't get 100, right? And so we are in this strange world where when the website is slow, we automatically blame the developer and we basically say, oh, the developer messed up. But yet, if you look around you, you notice that all of the websites are slow. So there's either two explanations, right? Either all the developers are idiots and nobody can do this, which seems unlikely, right? Or the approach we're taking is systematic problem to the industry, and the approach we're taking forces us into this horrible state. And the fact that even the brightest minds of Amazon or whatever cannot really get out of this mess. To me, this is a statement that this is a systemic problem, right? This isn't the problem of a developer. The problem isn't that the developer is not trying hard enough. The problem is that the tools we have given to the developer kind of force you down a particular path that ends up in the slow websites. And the reason you end up in the slow websites, as I said, is because of that fat arrow over there, and there is no way to kind of get around it. So the existing systems kind of mess these things up. So pictures worth 1,000 words. So let me show you some demos. And I'm going to start maybe with a to-do app, because we're kind of running low on time, and there's lots of stuff I could show you. But let me just get the font up.
Misko, I think this goes without saying. We're not going to stop you if you go over your time. We're recording this. I'm not leaving till you leave.
Okay.
Don't fry our brains too much. And remember, we'll stay for questions after, but it's okay if we go out past.
But I will try to show the most important bits, right? Yeah. So here is a to-do application, right? You've seen this millions of times. There's a famous to-do MVC that I basically grabbed this out of. Nothing really here is really that interesting in terms of a to-do app. But what I want to show you is the network tab. So what I did is I said, show me only the JavaScript. And I tapped in Vite over here because currently this is running in a dev mode and it does hot module refreshing, etc. And so the Vite injects some JavaScript. And this is not present in production. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to filter out Vite, and I'm just going to say, pretend this is not here, because in production, none of this stuff is, Vite is a development tool, not a production tool. So Vite doesn't count. So Vite's not here. And what I want to show you is that there is no JavaScript that is actually being downloaded. Now, it's not 100% true, right? There is this thing called Qwik Loader, this tiny polyfill that I talked about. Right now, it's not in a minified mode, but you can see it's not that much code, right? Like, if you scroll it, it's not a ridiculous quantity of code. So this magnifies to about a kilobyte worth of code. And so what this Qwik Loader allows us to do is to lazy load code. Okay, so let's look at the network tab. And now let me start interacting with the application. So let's say I say hello. Notice a whole bunch of code downloads. But it's not the whole application that downloads, because when I hit enter, more code downloads. When I click an item, more code downloads. When I download the item, more code downloads. When I select the filter, more code downloads. When I click something else, so the point I want to show you is that existing apps have this, or the existing frameworks basically get you into this world where the whole thing gets front-loaded, right? Again, to go back into this this view here, everything is front-loaded in existing framework. You end up with this one humongous fat thing that has to happen at the very, very beginning. And the change here is that instead of ending up with one humongous fat bundle at the very beginning, we instead figured out how to break this thing up into small bundles. Now, here is a thing that it needs to be pointed out. All frameworks claim that they can do lazy loading. And I'm going to try to convince you that for the most part, they're lying.
Hey, so that means that you lied when you did it in Angular.
Yeah, so let me
Shots fired.
Shots fired. Yeah, exactly.
It's getting crazy in here. Y'all be nice now. Come on.
So let me show you how this kind of works in existing frameworks, and I think it's going to make more sense. So here's your app. It's server-side rendered, and so it's gray, meaning it's not interactive, right? Like you can't do anything, and so we need to set up listeners. So the way this works is the server sends SSR, then a browser goes and downloads JavaScript for the application, and then the JavaScript is executed, and in the process of executing, the framework can reconnect all the listeners, and now everything becomes interactive, right? This is how existing systems work.
Do you need to show the downloading the console here or the network tab for this demo?
Oh no, I don't.
Because it's too small.
Okay, so here. Okay, so this kind of how existing systems work, and then you go like, great. So I'm gonna have lazy loading system, right? And so you put all kinds of lazy loaded boundaries in your application. And so the application server-side renders on the system, and then the browser downloads the initial code, it executes the initial code, and it hydrates kind of the root components. And then it comes across a lazy loaded boundary and says, you know what? I see that there's a lazy loader boundary, but I still need to traverse it because I need to figure out where the listeners are for this particular components, right? So it does another round trip to the server, downloads the lazy loader components, and then executes them. And so the thing to understand about existing frameworks is while they have lazy loading, the lazy loading is only useful for components that are currently not on the page, right? So it's useful for routing. So it's useful when you like are on route 1 versus route 2. And so route 2 has different components than route 1. And so in that sense, it is super useful to have lazy loading. But for what is currently on a page, if the component is on a page, then lazy loading is not a thing. Like it's not possible to not load the component, because otherwise, if you don't load it, the component is not interactive, and therefore it doesn't work. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over Astro, and so I'm going to go directly to just Qwik. And so the thing that's different about Qwik is that you have your application like here, and then let's say you interact with this component. Oops, I clicked on the wrong spot. Let's say you interact with this component, then only that component gets made interactive, right? And as you go around the application and interact with different components, more of these components become interactive. Now, the thing that I want to point out, and the big kind of a subtle thing that once you understand, you go like, whoa, that the implications are crazy of this thing, is that when we wake up a component, and we call this resuming, not hydration, and I can go into details as why we think it's a different term. When we resume a component, notice what didn't happen. We didn't automatically resume the parent or the child component, right? We were able to contain the, so to speak, the damage of running the JavaScript to just that component, right? Because if we had to wake up the parent component, then it would cascade all the way to the root. And if we had to wake up the child component, again, it would cascade all the way to the leaf. And so you would, the moment you would interact with an application, like huge swaths of code would have to execute. And remember, we want to do this lazily. We only want to add the behavior when you actually click on something or interact or mouse move or something of that sort. And so we can't have like expensive operations that are about to happen, right? And waking up like the whole hierarchy of your components on a first click would be just prohibitively expensive. And so it's not possible. And so the key thing that Qwik can do is to just wake up individual components independently from everybody else, right? And this is the thing that no other framework can do, right? Like I really want you to kind of get this thing wrapped in your head, is that the reason we're building Qwik is not because I think Qwik is a better way in terms of developer experience of building apps. I think it's better in terms of what the user gets, right? Because it can do these tricks that existing systems cannot do. Now, that's the one trick. The second trick that the framework has to do is, imagine this is a button that says add to the shopping cart. When I click this button, the shopping cart is usually here. So when I click here, I need to wake up that other component as well. And this is a thing that is also very important and really hard to do, because the way most frameworks solve this problem is they say, okay, you modified the state of the application. Yeah, something needs to be re-rendered. I don't know what, so screw it. We'll just re-render the whole world, right? And the moment you say, we re-rendered the whole world, game over. Like, you can't do that. Too expensive, right? So you need to come up with ways and some mechanisms where every single operation you do is both inexpensive in terms of the amount of code that you download, but also inexpensive in the amount of execution time that is applied to this particular problem, right? And this is why this is a hard problem. And the way existing frameworks solve this particular problem is they just say, forget it, we'll just do everything upfront. But the upfront is so expensive that it makes everything really slow. So let's go back to our to-do example, right? And so this is where this idea of resumability comes in, that we have a network tab, and as I interact with the application, more and more code downloads. Okay, so let's do a super simple example. Actually, let's do a counter so that I can explain to you how this whole thing works. So let's say I click on hello, and the hello download. Yes.
Thanks.
Let's say I click on hello, and the hello downloads a piece of code. And in this case, it just says console log. And so the next question which should be like, well, how do you actually do this? So counter. How's that on font? Here is an example of how to write a counter. Now, for Angular people, this is going to be like, it's different. If you are a React person, you look at this and you're like, this looks just like React. And this is not a coincidence. One of the things is that I cared more about like being able to do something that other frameworks cannot do, rather than come up with yet another templating syntax or yet another compiler for the templating syntax, etc. And so I was trying to reuse as many things off the shelf as possible. And so reusing JSX was like a no-brainer. Like type checking is already present, tools are available, code completion is working. Like I didn't have to do anything. So I just kind of used JSX out of the box.
We appreciate that.
So, sorry, did you have a question?
No, I just said we appreciate that.
Okay. So let's say you have a counter, right? And the thing I want you to notice is like, and this is the problem for all frameworks, is that when you have a button, the button is a closure, right? It closes over stuff. And so if you look at your the tooling systems like rollup, etc., they only see a single export. They only see counter. And so the only thing they can download is at the minimum this whole file, right? But notice what actually happens. The system is very smart about the whole thing and says, actually, when you click on the hello, the only thing I need to download is just the console.log hello, nothing else, right? And so, of course, if you look at the output, right, if I refresh this, looking at hello, prints ABC. So from the point of view of the developer, like, yeah, this is totally a natural way of writing the code and the application. But what actually happens underneath is that the framework looks at the whole thing and says, yeah, but when you click on this button, really the only thing you need is this piece of code right here and nothing else. And so the thing is, as a developer, I would never put this into a separate file because, well, I'll give you two reasons in a second. But it's like you don't think about it, right? Like you don't want to do it. You just want to do it naturally. So what actually happens is that this piece of code right here, we do something like this, and then a separate file, you do export const foo equals, or you do default or something. Okay, the exact syntax is not important here, right? But basically, we have this thing called optimizer that can take code and extract it into a top-level export, and then the bundler system can do all the magic for it. And because we can export this particular piece of code, we can break up your application into teeny tiny pieces. So me clicking on the hello downloads this piece of code here. But me clicking on this button downloads different piece of code. And so now you have this situation where, if you think about it, you have multiple entry points, right? There's different way that the application gets bootstrapped depending on how you interact with it. Sanders, I see your hand is up, so just give me a second. And so this is kind of where the magic comes in. And specifically, I want to show you this. You see how this says store count ++? If you just pull this out, notice what happens is you get the red squiggly here. And the red squiggly basically says, you can't do this. You can't pull this out, because doing so would, it refers to a variable that's in here. And so this is not a thing you can do. And so existing frameworks can't do this trick, right? They can't break up existing stuff. But what Qwik can do is it can produce a special piece of code here that knows how to restore the store, or specifically knows how to resume the state of the application where it was left over. So when you execute a piece of code that just says store.count++, right? The obvious question you have to answer is like, what is the current count? Like if you want to increment it, it's fine, but what is the current count? Without that piece of information, you can't resume the application, right? So the key part of resuming an application is not just being able to break it up into tiny pieces, but the key part is to actually know what are you resuming from. So if it's something like adding an item or deleting an item, or in this particular case as incrementing a count, you need to say like, what is the current count? And you need to be able to resume this. Without that, the whole thing doesn't work. So we have basically the magic of Qwik. The reason why all of this amazing things can happen is because Qwik knows how to take your closure, turn it into a top-level export, and then lazy load it on as-needed basis. So I'm going to pause here. I see, Sanders, you have a question, so go. You're muted. At least I can't hear you.
I muted myself for safety reasons. Most frameworks are using bundlers, but this is basically more of an unbundler in practice.
It's more complicated. So we use rollup bundler at the bottom, and we could use Webpack or whatever else you want. And currently in a development mode, what you're actually seeing is Vite running. So it's a kind of a no bundling at all. So the operation we call the optimization, the optimizer, that operation's job is to create entry points into your system, right? The reason why the current bundlers can't do anything useful, or they always end up with a single chunk for your application, is because there's only one entry point to your system, and that single entry point is really the bootstrap, right? The main method of your application. And as long as you only have a single bootstrap, right, the only thing you can do is create a single chunk and execute it from that single entry point. So the thing that Qwik is doing different is that Qwik essentially creates a separate bootstrap for every single listener. For every single way you could possibly interact with the system, you have a different bootstrap, right? And you can see that by the kind of code you load, right? Clicking here downloads different code than clicking here. That produces a different bootstrap. And the whole thing is predicated on this ability to have multiple entry points. So the magical part of Qwik is that you write your code like you would normally write it in a natural way, and then Qwik automatically generates entry points for you.
Yeah, my question is actually, isn't it, you end up with boatloads of small script downloads, which might be fine on HTTP 2, but not everything is yet on HTTP 2. So is there a performance penalty of this?
All right, so everybody asks this question. It's the first question everybody asks, and I need to format it differently. So here is an actual application here. Let's go to docs. And so the answer is you generate a bunch of prefetches. So there's a couple of ways to answer that. Yes, it's thousands of files that generates for a typical application. And at first, it might seem like a bad idea, but it turns out that the hard part is breaking your application into pieces. That is by far the most complicated thing. Putting it back together is trivial. Like, it's fundamentally just concatenating files together, right? So the hard part is breaking it all up. Putting it back together is easy. Now, you say, well, why would I want to break everything up just to put it back together? Well, because the thing that Qwik can do is that it can do something we call dynamic tree shaking. Basically, it means that when you do static tree shaking, which is something you're familiar with, in static tree shaking, the system looks at the main entry point and says, what are all the possible things that I can reach for here from this particular startup point? And the answer is the whole application, right? Because if you couldn't reach the whole application, then you couldn't build the whole application. So the answer has to be the whole application is reachable from the main method, right? And there's no other way around this. Now, when you execute the application executes, and now you can do dynamic tree shaking, which means now that the application is running, you can answer a slightly different question, which is, if I click this button, what possible things do I need to download in order to re-render or update, etc.? And the set of items you get there is way smaller than when you originally try to do a static tree shaking. And so what you do is you say, like, well, what are all possible things that the user can do? Well, the user can click on here, you can click here, and you follow all these things, and you find all the possible things that the user can reach, and you realize that the amount of things that the user can reach is way smaller than when you originally need to render the application. So the set of files you get here is first of all way smaller than the overall application, but it gets better. One of the things you can do is you can sort these things by the probability that the user is going to interact. If you have a single chunk, then the whole chunk has to download before you can do anything, right? If you have multiple chunks, then you can keep statistical information about like how the users actually interact with the application. And then you can sort these things in the order of probability that the user is going to interact. So you can say like, oh, most likely the person is going to hit, add to shopping cart. It's very unlikely that the person is going to go and click on log out, right? And so you can sort these in the probability. The other thing you can do is you can look at that, oh, whenever the user clicks this button, we also have to download these other things. And so it probably makes a good idea to put all of these other things together into the same bundle. And so there's all kinds of bundling strategies that you can do. The problem is that existing systems, because they have a single entry point, they can only come up with a single bundle, and that's that. Once you have lots and lots of entry points, then all kinds of possibilities open up into how you put them together in some reasonable things. And so the short answer is you can prefetch it. And I want to really point out that there's a huge difference between downloading code, which if you look at the hydration problem, the download is probably like 10 or 20% of the overall time spent, and actually the execution of all that code, which is easily 80-90% of the overall time, right? So even in the worst possible outcome, where we have to download all of the code, which is the best possible outcome for the existing system, the existing system's best possible outcome is our worst possible outcome. Even in that particular case, we don't execute anything. So even in that case, like, we win, right? So no matter how you slice this, you're always going to end up with less code, and the code that you download, we don't execute. And so the short answer is you do prefetching, and it's not a problem at all. So that was kind of a huge detour, and I know everybody always asks for it, so I just wanted to do that. I see, Tito, you have a question? Your hand is up?
Yeah, I do. Coming back to the closure part of the code you just explained, does that mean that this takes care of like the store? This takes care of services, like you have an entry, you have a source of truth, something like that.
Yeah, it takes care of all of that. Again, this is following more React style. React don't really have services. It's like up to you to kind of define them, etc. The only thing that you really have to worry about is that whenever you close, so I haven't talked about the dollar signs, we should talk about that. Whenever you whenever you cross the lazy loaded entries, sort of like here, the store is everybody here, and then in order to get the store to this location, you have to cross over this dollar sign, right? So this is lazy loaded. Whenever you cross a lazy loaded boundary, you have to make sure that this thing is serialized. That's the requirement. And so look at the dollar signs. What the dollar signs mean is that every time you as a developer and the optimizer sees a dollar sign, what follows the dollar sign gets turned into a lazy loaded chunk. And not just a lazy loaded chunk, but an entry point. So it becomes a possibility for making chunks and bundling and all kinds of other things, right? So every time you say dollar sign, you have to kind of, as a developer, you have to be like, certain rules apply with the dollar sign. Mainly things like, I can refer to things, but I have to make sure that things are serializable across it. So like, this works fine, but if I try to do something like create a promise in the variable and then try to capture the promise or refer to the promise here, the system will complain saying like, the promise, like, I don't know how to serialize this thing. Like, what does it mean for the promise to exist on the server and then being captured and then go to the client and restore? Like, that's just nonsense. So you can't do that, right? But as long as you can follow the rule, then you kind of get this. So the thing to understand is that every time you see this dollar sign, you are creating a lazy loaded boundary, right? And so let's go back into this application. What I find super cool about it is when I click on hello, the system is like, yeah, the only thing you need is just console.log. Nothing else is required to download, right? And so it's very surgical about like understanding that like the only thing you need is that, nothing else downloads. But if I click on this button, so let me refresh this again, and it says, oh, you need to increment the count, right? But once the count gets incremented, the system's like, yeah, but I need to also update the, in order to get the use lexical scope, I have to download the core, right? So that's the framework that has to be shipped. In the first case, no framework even got shipped because the system correctly identified that you don't even need the framework. So that's the framework. Then the framework identifies the fact that you need to get the JSX, and so you get the JSX. What in the world is the JSX runtime? I don't even know what that is. Oh, it's just this file being split apart in a separate thing. Okay, that's interesting why that happens. So the only thing we need here is just a component. And so the only thing that downloaded is really just a button that knows the count and a piece of code that knows how to update it. Now, of course, this is kind of the whole app, and so it's not really that interesting. But let me back up and do another demo, which I think is super interesting. So here's the clock, and again, notice no JavaScript being downloaded, right? And the clock is below the fold. And so if I scroll the clock into the view, code downloads, and the clock shows the current time. And so let's break this down into what I would have to do as a developer, and then let's look at the files that actually downloaded to kind of make sense of all of it. So the first thing I want to show you is how you would write this. So we start off with a clock application, and we return a JSX, which is the whole point of this component is to just basically create a whole bunch of text so that the clocks are below the fold, right? So like to generate all this stuff. And then we have 2 copies of the clock in here. And this is the definition of a clock. And notice that everything's in a single file, right? So everything as far as the developer is concerned is a single file. So what does the clock say? Clock says, well, I need these styles. Here is my state to kind of keep data binding. I need a client effect. I will explain it in a second. And then, this is how the clock gets rendered, right? And so in here, I need to change the angles of the minute, hour, and second hand, depending on what time it is. And so use client effect basically says, this is a kind of code that I need to run on the client in order to kind of wake up the system. And so here we have an update function that simply says, look at the current time, figure out what the angles are for the second, minute, and hour, call the update, and do so every 1 second. And then you're responsible for creating a clear function so that when the clock gets destroyed, the system knows to clean up after yourself, right? So this is kind of a very natural way of writing it. And yet it has this interesting behavior, which is that no JavaScript, right? Even though clearly clock has to be updated on a client, no JavaScript until the clock comes into view, and then the JavaScript shows up. And so why is that? Well, because the use client effect is basically says, do this thing after rendering. And so the question becomes like, well, when exactly after rendering? And so if you have a normal application that is hydrated on the client, the answer is very simple. You do it as soon as hydration is over. But there is no hydration here. And so when exactly are you supposed to do this? And so the default behavior of the use client effect is to actually do it when the component becomes visible. And so let me show you this from a different point of view. Let's look at the generated code. Here's our div, here is our 2 clocks. So here is our hands, right? And now notice what happens here. As I start scrolling, the moment the first clock shows up, this thing updated. And then every 1 second, this thing updates in here, right? But the other clock is still sound asleep. It's not resumed. It's still doing, it's whatever it does. And again, when the clock becomes available, when it comes into the view, immediately it wakes up and updates it. And of course, the user never saw any of this coming. Now, if you look at the network tab, what you see here is obviously the code that wakes up that goes and updates every 1 second, right? This is the thing that has to get downloaded and instantiated. And of course, we need the framework, and then of course we need the code to update the clock, right? This is the JSX to update the component. But notice what didn't download. We didn't download the clock application, right? The system correctly deduced that like, oh, this component never needs to be sent to the client. Like, why would I send this to the client? There's nothing here that will cause a re-rendering. And so I added a button here for clicking on this. And so notice if I refresh this, Nothing's in the client. When I click, notice again how surgical the system is and says like, oh yeah, I need to print the console log, but like in this particular case, I don't even need to download the framework because even that is not even necessary. So it's very like, it really tries super hard to be just saying like, what is the absolute minimum of code that I have to ship to the client to satisfy this particular operation?
Fine-grained lazy loading.
Fine-grained lazy loading, right? And doing it in a way where the developer experience is not horrendous. And so the magical bit that we came up with is basically these dollar signs. Now I want to show you one more demo, and then I'm going to let you open up for questions.
Like dollar watch for the veterans here.
A dollar watch, yeah, that's kind of it. So the other demo I want to show you is that I've been kind of showing you these applications like the counter. I showed you the clock, and you might be thinking that like, oh, those are actually separate applications. But what if I told you that the whole thing is just a single application, right? And so let me show you. Here, I'm in this all component. I am actually inserting all of the components got inserted into here. And notice, no JavaScript, right? And yeah, let's scroll the clock. Clock loads. Let's interact with some of these buttons. They load, and keep an eye on JavaScript, right? More code downloads, interactions, clicking, canceling. Every time I interact with the system just downloads the necessary code to make that particular interaction and nothing else, right? So even though this looks like a separate application because I'm going back and forth, it's actually a single application written together as one unit. And then when I navigate to, for example, the counter, the system is just really smart about the fact that like, yeah, I know it's a whole application that has routing and all these things and all these pieces that exist, but none of the stuff you need. So I'm not even going to bother shipping it. Oh yeah, I want to show you one more thing. Sorry, I know I said it was the last demo. I want to show you one more demo. So one thing should be like, well, how does this work? And so the way this works is that there is this state of the system, which we call JSON, quick JSON. And in here, basically everything is available. So actually, let me look at the click button over here. So this basically says that here's a button. If you click on me, you need to go download this piece of JavaScript. And in that JavaScript, you will find this symbol being exported. And oh, by the way, you need to restore this particular state in order to make this thing work, right? So that's what this kind of means. And this store is in here. So in this particular case, when I click on this 0 here points to this object right here. This is how the system knows that to start from counting from 0, because that's what it is, right? So if I go to the counter and I say start counting from, I don't know, 10, notice that it shows 10 over here, but also if you look at the JSON, now the JSON says 10, right? And so that's how the system knows how to kind of where to go from. And when you click on this button, what downloads is a piece of code right here. And this says, go and increment the count. And so what you get here is you actually get a proxy. And so if you refresh this again, there is subscriptions. And this proxy says, if you modify the count property, right, you have just invalidated component 0. And so what is a component 0? Well, that's this component right here. And this component points basically into this URL that says like, oh, if this component becomes invalidated, you will need to go and download this particular bit. But notice what's not in this thing. Like, there is no references to other components because the system correctly kind of figured all this stuff out. Let me show you this to you in a slightly different way. Here's our store count.
Don't forget, this is very new for all of us. And
yes, I'll shut up in a second.
And we have questions in the chat.
Okay.
You can't teach all of it in one night.
This is the beautiful mind part, right? This is like a...
So let me just show you this thing, which I think is amazing. Now, I promise I'll shut up. If I do false and end over here, and if I put a false in here, right? So now this particular code never executes. I never execute this particular part over here, right? Actually, I think, okay, because the capture, okay, let me just do false, and I'm just going to basically comment this out. So I'm just going to delete this, right? I'm going to comment out this piece of code. So notice now there is no way to update the count. And because there's no way to update the count, this component should never ever download, right? If you look at the generated JSON, notice it's empty. The system was like, I looked at it and the system was like, yeah, there is no way for you to even like attempt to modify any of this stuff. I am not even going to bother serializing anything. Like the simple act that you're no longer referring to the store, that change of code right there allowed you to completely remove this stuff. And now that I'm referring to it again, it comes back in here. Okay, so I know there was a lot, and I'm going to stop, and I'm just going to let the questions go.
But Bonnie, I have two important things that I think should be said, okay, before we go to the questions, okay? Just one quick thing, So about the, Misko is showing like you click on the thing, it downloads like 4 files, you click on another thing. Just remember that this is the basic ability, right? But in real apps in production, this won't be downloading 4 files on each click and all that stuff. It will be prefetched already, so it will just execute these 4 files instantly, okay? Because they will already be downloaded and parsed, okay? So this is one thing, and I completely forgot the second thing. So let's move on to the question.
Okay, and so I'm glad you brought up the prefetch thing. I want to show you something else that I think is worth pointing out, which is that when you build an application, you build an app, it's working, and then the marketing department shows up and says, what about the SEO? How does the search engine supposed to do this, right? So here is a pretty complicated application which has an editor, it has a demo, et cetera, and a lot of stuff in here. And if you do view page source, how do I get the view page source? You're going to notice that all of the text, everything for this app is already in here. Of course, a lot of styling on the front. Where is the text? Everything's basically inlined in here. Somewhere in here must be text. Oh, it's probably, I don't know where it is. But you get my point, right? My point is, this is already serialized into the system. And so SEO just works out of the box. Like you never, ever have to think about SEO.
This is what I wanted to say, because you had another important thing to know about Qwik is that why is it called resumable? Okay, they render everything. We render everything on the node part or the server part, which is runs JavaScript, and we generate the HTML with all the state, as you saw in JSON, on the server side. This all get like a snapshot sent to the client, and then you can resume from whenever you stopped on the server. And Misko has this great analogy for VMs, virtual machines, right? So Misko, if you just tell it, and then we go.
Okay, so the virtual thing is like, I don't know if you played with VMs, but they have this interesting property where like you're like, I'm on a Mac and I can boot up Linux, right? So in my virtual machine, right? And once I boot up Linux, I can open up a whole bunch of applications. Let's say I open up Word or Chrome or whatever, and then you pause it, you save it, and it writes everything to the disk, and then you take that file and you can send it to all your friends. You can send it to 50 of your friends, and all 50 friends open up that file, and they're exactly where they left off. And more specifically, they skip the boot up process, right? It's not like they boot up and open up the applications to get to the same state. No, the VM just opens up in the correct state, completely skipping all of the boot up process. And that's what we do when we talk about resumability, right? Our applications start their execution on the server. They at some point, we basically do the save button, right? We save everything to the disk. And once we save everything to the disk, we send it in form of HTML to the client, and now it's resumable, right? Whenever the user starts interacting it, we don't go through the boot up process, right? We literally just continue where the person left off.
Mic drop. Questions.
Minds are blown. I'm in the chat going, I told you they were going to blow your minds. I told you emerging technology, you guys. I would never steer you wrong. Okay, so I just want to pause for a second. Let's all just sit and just take a deep breath. Let this sink in. Very exciting. We're just going to slow down for a minute. And Tito, ask us your question.
I think this is very exciting. Like, I'm excited, but of course this is my baby, so I have reasons to be excited.
It's definitely recorded, Pavel. We're definitely, give me a minute because I have to put everything up on YouTube, so it'll take a minute, but yes, we're definitely going to share the recording, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, Miko. Going back to where you took off the counter plus plus, yeah, you replace it with a false.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean it does garbage cleaning like immediately, or is smart in garbage cleaning? It virtually knows, doesn't have to render that.
Yeah. So the way that it works is when we pause the system, right? When we hit the pause button on a system, just like garbage collectors, they have this idea of roots, and they start at the roots and they look for everything that's reachable from the root, and everything that is not reachable from the root is garbage and it can be thrown away. So in the same exact way, Qwik works the same way. We basically look at all of the listeners, right? We start with the listeners and say, like, these are the only places where the user can interact. So listeners are roots for that sense. And then we go from the root and say, okay, what is reachable from this listener? And then we keep pulling on all the objects until we can't find any new stuff. And then we take all that stuff and you serialize it and send it to the client, right? And so in this particular case, when I remove the reference store, right, when the store gets removed and I replace it with like 1, 2, 3, let's say, what I have just done is I have severed the connection from the listener to here.
Okay.
And so when the system goes and looks at all the listeners, it says, okay, so what is reachable from this listener? And the answer is nothing. What's reachable from this listener? And the answer is nothing. And so it says, okay, so now I won't serialize anything. Nothing's reachable. And it is correct because it's not reachable, right? Store can't be modified, and because store won't modify, this component won't modify, and so it's kind of a cascade effect, and everything gets thrown away. And I actually have a nice demo of that here.
Wow.
So here's a Hacker News, which this actually went to the server and fetched the actual current news. So this is like literally as of 2 hours ago. And what's cool about it is if you look at the JSON that produced the state of the system when it's serialized, it's nothing. It looked at the whole thing and basically said, yeah, there's no way you can possibly interact with this application that would result in any state changes. And therefore, there's no need to send anything to the client. Right? So the whole Hacker News, like I love how React server components, right? They're solving the same problem in this complicated whatever way. And here we're like, yeah, we can just look at it and be like, no, nothing. Like all this stuff got run on the server. Like so we have server components, and then we just look at them and be like, nah, nothing to update here, and so we just throw everything away. Now you say, well, what about something more interesting? Like if I click on a comment, in this particular case, again, most of the stuff is immutable and I can't change it. But notice there's behavior here now, which is this button I can collapse and expand, right? And so because there is a behavior, when I refresh this, you see that a whole bunch of things got serialized. Specifically, the individual components got their state serialized, whether they're open or closed, right? So that's what you see over here. And of course, we need to serialize information about what to re-render in case of the component changes. But if you look through it, what you won't see is the other components that were responsible for building this app. And of course, what you won't see is the original data that came from the server, because the system correctly deduced that it's unreachable, and so it threw it away.
Wow.
Okay, we have more questions. Akila.
Yeah, I'm kind of new to this, and I don't know exactly what's going on, but
There's several of us that don't know what's going on. It's okay.
but there was, a while ago, I was really trying to learn WebAssembly or trying to understand what WebAssembly is, and I ran into this article, and you don't have to answer it now, I guess, or it's this article that talks about server-side rendering in React, and it uses something called WASM Edge, where it seems like they're trying to solve the same problem. What's the difference in using something like WebAssembly, where you can use, I guess, maybe like a different language that's a bit faster, where you don't have to worry about the performance as much, using something like that rather than just trying to learn a new framework? Does that question make sense?
No, it makes total sense. So WebAssembly is a faster way of executing your code. And so in that sense, like if you can do something faster, good idea, right? And you should totally do it. Turns out WebAssembly has a lot of complications. And when it comes to frameworks, it's not as simple as it first appears to be. And so I haven't read the article, but I'm sure there were lots of caveats of like, oh yeah, but this doesn't quite work and this doesn't quite work. But it's sort of like if you squint hard enough, maybe you can see like how it could all come together, etc. So in my opinion, WebAssembly is great for execution, make something fast, but it's not actually all that good for frameworks. Now, having said that, the big difference between something like WebAssembly and Qwik is that Qwik is fast not because it tries to be efficient or fast in terms of like doing all the work. Qwik is fast because it basically is smart about like figuring out what work doesn't have to be done, right? And so it's a completely different kind of a mind shift, right? Like imagine somebody gives you lots and lots of chores and you're like, great, I'm going to use WebAssembly to go through the chores faster. And then the other person comes and be like, yeah, how about I just don't do them because they're unnecessary.
Difference between efficient and effective.
Yeah, efficient and effective, right? And also, isn't there like some story from Aesop about like somebody was given a job to clear a stable and then he redirected a river? Something. Does that ring a bell for anybody? No? I need to find it.
And you need to write a dead joke for it.
Well, what about the cost of the learning curve? Do you think like it would be worth more to just use what you know, kind of, to use something like WebAssembly to kind of like fake performance versus using something that's probably very hard to adopt? I don't know if it's hard. I have looked at the docs.
So I get your question. First of all, I don't think it's hard to adopt because if you look at it, you know React, this is going to be like, oh my gosh, this like totally looks like React. Like there's not much in terms of learning there. Turns out that actually learning WebAssembly is complicated. So taking on WebAssembly is a huge complexity that I would just not recommend. So that in itself, like in my opinion, kind of breaks that argument. But as far as adaptability and learning new things, the way it actually works out is once you know a particular framework, it's relatively easy to learn the next one, right? Because the ideas are the same, but the actual syntax is slightly different. And the hard part isn't the syntax. The hard part is the ideas, right? And so once you know an existing framework, to learn a new one is a very small investment in time and effort. The real reasons why people don't necessarily learn or go to new frameworks is that the hard part isn't learning them. The hard part is that you have existing systems that have taken, hundreds of man hours or thousands of man hours to build, and now you would have to migrate them over. And so that's a huge undertaking that most people don't necessarily want to do. But the issue isn't really learning new stuff. Like that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to go off on a tangent because you just reminded me of something, which is that we are working on this bridge between Qwik and React so that you can just take React components and run them and use them inside of Qwik. And the reason for that, there's two reasons for that is, one is we need to have a material library, and so we can just use the React one. And the second reason for that is that basically it does something like Astro, but way better. And so you can start with a big monolithic app and slowly with Qwik break it up. But it's a whole separate presentation discussion that,
and by the way, I think only 2% know what Astro is.
Yes.
Not only here in the entire world. I just learned about it like recently. So just FYI.
Just FYI, yeah. So we have some other cool stuff going on. But anyways, more questions. I think Michelle?
Mikhail, it's Dutch.
Mikhail, sorry.
Mikhail, hi. Yeah, thanks very much for this demonstration. Really mind-blowing stuff, this, and I can only imagine how complex this is to get it right. And fantastic. Two questions really. Because it's kind of loading on demand, what is the effect of high latency networks on kind of the UX part of this? That would be question one, and then especially things like satellite internet connections with fairly high latency. And question number two, this seems to go a lot further than just TTI, right? Because I mean, you can easily, I would say, full TTI by just doing the first step of what you've built, right? So with the first interaction, you can still load the entire thing if you would want to. Is there a specific advantage of loading everything on demand? And then also thinking back about my first question. Like latency?
So the latency, the answer there is prefetching, right? The framework actually generates this list. So one of the things kind of that's different about Qwik is, as I said, like Qwik is responsible not just for rendering, but the whole pipeline. And it even gets more meta, which is that the pipeline information about what system exists, we call this the manifest. And the manifest is actually available to Qwik at runtime, so that at runtime, Qwik can reason about like what are the parts of the system and how do I download them, and etc. So that's kind of different. So because the system has manifest, Qwik actually generates the prefetch list for you. Right. And so because it generates the prefetch list, what happens is the browser immediately starts downloading the code that might be needed. Right? It doesn't execute it, but it immediately downloads. And because of that, the high latency stuff kind of problem just goes away. So kind of let me see if I can go to so here's a button here, and let's look at the network tab. Let me refresh this again. I think you need to do all, and then in this case we want to do, I think, p dash. No, it's /build. Here we go. So here's where the files are coming from this URL. And what we see here is that when I click on this button, right, all this code got prefetched, and so now it's in the cache. And so when I click on this button, you see that all of them are just cache hits, right? So actually no network happened. Because of that. And also these URLs are, as you can see, there's hashes inside of them. So they're set up to be cached forever. Basically the framework takes care of all this stuff. So you don't have to think about it.
And the prefetch doesn't cost you kind of lighthouse things because...
Correct, it does not.
Right. Excellent.
Which, if you think about it, that is the correct behavior, right? Like prefetch is basically a hint to the browser saying like, if you have nothing else going on,
right,
go get this, right?
So it doesn't stop the threat or something. It's just...
That's right. And so we can like simulate let me disable the cache the first time you come here. When you refresh, now it actually goes and fetches the stuff, right? And it's all ready. And now I can go and click. And again, I don't know why when you disable the cache. Okay, let me refresh this again. So if you disable the cache, the stuff happens. And then I think if you turn this off and click, then it comes out of the cache hits, right?
It's even more brilliant. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks.
I think it's brilliant, but of course this is me, baby.
This is really nice. This is so cool. Yeah.
So this is what I mean. Like, this is what I want you to understand. Like, once you see all this stuff, and I agree that in my opinion, it's mind blowing. But again, my opinion is partial. What I want you to understand is like existing frameworks just can't touch this. Like, there's no, it's not like they're going to be like, oh yeah, let me add that feature. That seems like a good feature. Let me add. No, this is such a fundamental shift in the whole approach, is that you just can't catch up with this thing.
Yeah.
And this is why it's generation 3.
This is brand new generation, right? I am predicting that a whole new set of frameworks are going to be spawned, just like AngularJS spawned a whole bunch of frameworks that are all fundamentally the same idea with better syntax, right? I think this approach will spawn a whole set of frameworks. And this is part of the reason why, I had a choice between doing something completely different or doing this that became Qwik. And I almost felt like I owe it to the world. I was like, we're doing this so wrong. And I can't help myself but be like, okay, nobody's fixing this. Nobody's even thinking about it. Like, let's fix this and do one last thing before I retire.
Have you actually considered? I mean, I know there were some talks a few years ago about smarter hydration in Angular SSR. Have you actually thought about trying this with Angular and then thought,
Oh,
no, that's not going to work. It's just too much.
that is just like a raise,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah,
We-
I had originally, when I gave the talk, I thought maybe Angular could do this. And as I went deeper and deeper into this problem space, I realized that existing frameworks just cannot do this. Like, it's such a fundamental change
Right.
that for existing frameworks to take this on, they would completely break backwards compatibility with everything, their whole ecosystem, right? In other words, it's a brand new framework. It's no way to take an existing framework and do this. And I have a separate talk that I give of where I go deep onto, like, what are all the technical problems that we had to solve in order to get here. And it's a very fascinating, like, deep dive, if you're into that kind of stuff. But
Do you think Angular could take some of this and adopt it into Angular at some point in the future?
it's unlikely, in my opinion.
That's there's another question regarding that, which Tim asked, any chance of a bridge from Angular, like Quickify for React, but Quickify for Angular?
Yeah, so I actually reached out to Angular team and I said, hey, what do you think? We should build it. And they were initially excited, and then somehow they were like, oh, we're too busy, we don't have time for it. So maybe later.
Sounds familiar.
Hey, Misko, we're actually having Emma come in a couple of weeks to talk about hydration in Angular. It's a spike. We're just talking hypothetically, like, how would this work?
Yep.
So maybe you could join us for the discussion.
Sure. Let me know.
Fun. I think Alex Rickabaugh is gonna. You know Alex Rickabaugh.
Of course, I know Alex.
Yeah. Well, you're always welcome to crash our parties. And
It's from the React team, no?
Alex Rickabaugh. And also because I was thinking, because Igor was talking to us a lot about hydration, and I was thinking how epically cool it would be to have a reunion of you and Alex Rickabaugh and Igor Minar on Angular Nation.
Yeah, it's a very deep topic though, and so I don't think an hour is enough. Like, you can go for hours. Like, as I discovered when I was in Israel, I apparently can go 7 hours talking about this.
Yeah. So just a side note. When Misko went to visit me, and we recorded 2 courses, which were like super cool with like cool new effects that I did. And the plan is, so we recorded the first course, a quick introduction. This is the name of the course. It will be on the GitHub, and like the video you see on the screen here, on the front page. And we recorded also a more advanced course, okay, and we're like still in the process of doing it, which will be like the follow-up course for that. And we also did a workshop with the top of the industry in Israel, like I mentioned before, and they had their mind blown as well. But we actually did the workshop. Most of the workshop was on the problem domain, like deep dive, a whole day on the problem domain. And guess what I did? I hired a video guy, and like with 3 cameras, and like did the whole like super high-end production of capturing this workshop. And this will be another high-end course about deep dive about the problem domains, which was like one of the most insane sessions that I ever been part of, with like top level people, all like running like 200 miles an hour on like the future of where we're going. So that's also will be available. So just like keep in mind for the future. And Bonnie, you will get the affiliate link. Don't worry.
So the other thing, actually, now that we kind of talk about it, we should talk about a little bit about the ecosystem. Right? So Qwik is the framework you kind of saw over here, but we also have this other thing called Qwik City. Qwik City is kind of the meta framework that sits on top of it, gives you routing, etc. So this site that you see over here, which has the documentation, the examples, tutorials, this complicated menu structure, etc. This thing is built using Qwik City.
And this is the next JS of Qwik, right? It's like
It's like the
for React.
Next.js or SvelteKit or one of those meta frameworks that existing frameworks have. So that goes on top of that. And then the other thing is we have, as I mentioned, we have the React Quickify, so that you can run your React applications inside of Qwik. And we have also PartyTown, which is another separate topic, which allows you to move third-party code into the web workers. So like the goal we have, right? Like if you pop high enough level, right? Our goal is very simple. Get JavaScript off of the main thread. That's it, right? I mean, the reason why the application is fast on startup is because the JavaScript is not there, right? So our whole effort that we're going after is how do we just get stuff off of the main thread? And so between PartyTown and Qwik, I think we have a very cohesive and very good story. And it's a story that nobody can really approach.
Misko?
Yes.
I think I speak for all of us. Raise your hands if you agree with me, just so that I know I'm speaking for all of us. I think that we need you to come back in a month or two. Let us think, let us play with it. Let this soak in our brains, and then we're going to need you to come back again, both of you, because we're going to have a lot more questions once we've look at the hands up. See, I speak for all of us. Will you come back once we've had time to let this soak into our brains, and then we're going to, well, we have more questions now, but also we just, as soon as you leave, we're just going to put you right back on the calendar, Misko.
Yeah, no, this is fun. I love talking about this, and I think it's important to get the word out. And your job here is to basically tell all your friends just how much your mind was blown and how different it is, right? I really need the world to understand is that there is this framework fatigue of people are like yet another framework, and I really want the world to understand that like this is not yet another one. This is fundamentally different, and it can do things that your other framework cannot. Right? So it's not another Svelte or Vue or whatever, which just has a different way of doing things. It's like fundamentally different approach to the whole problem.
Because you knew that there would be this learning curve, and you knew that it would be a whole new thing that people would have to adopt. But it's like when I built Angular Nation, like I knew that it wouldn't be easy, but there was a reason. And same thing with you, there's a reason, like it was worth all that work. It will be worth it. Okay, everybody hands down. Ratik, I know you have a question. Don't worry, I'm going to come to you in a minute. Hands down, everybody. One more question. Now that you've seen it, first impression, because we know it's a pain in the ass to completely change a whole thing, right? Just for Misko, when he goes to sleep at night, I want you guys to raise your hand if you think it's worth it. It's worth all the pain in the ass and the trouble. Is it worth it? Do you think he did the right thing?
I'm excited.
I think it's worth it too, but we'll see.
All right, hands down, everybody.
We actually, it's the whole June I spent going around and giving talks at different conferences, etc., talking to everybody, and I feel like there's a point of inflection where people are starting to get it. You can certainly see it on Twitter, where more and more people are kind of starting to mention it and kind of realizing what it is. And my favorite thing to do is, when I start this talk, everybody shows up usually extremely skeptical. Zero JavaScript, that's not possible. Being faster than whatever, it's not possible, right? And then by the end of the talk, they're like, oh, yeah, this is completely different. And they're like, their minds are blown, and they're like, yep, I'm a convert. I believe this. This is the way to do it. And I think somebody wrote it in a text, like, why weren't we doing this like this since the very beginning? I don't know, somewhere.
Glenn said that, I think.
Yeah, like why isn't it like this is so obvious? Why isn't it?
It's obvious now that you showed us.
Yes, that's the thing about everything in life, right? Like everything is obvious after the fact.
Yeah.
The stuff isn't obvious beforehand, and what's particularly not obvious is how to solve things, like how to break up. Like it was, even to me, it wasn't obvious that like the key to it was producing lots of entry points. This is not obvious at the beginning. Like you don't know that, and so it takes a while to kind of acquire all this knowledge and understand it. And only when you do all of that stuff can you be like, oh yeah, it's obvious. Like now that I explained it to you how it works, you go like, yeah, of course. Like how else would you do it?
Because we don't know what we don't know.
Yes.
Okay, back to questions. Ratik? Hello?
Yeah, sure. I'm audible. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi. So I don't know if it's a beginner question or not, but yeah, it somewhere came into my mind. So basically, right now we are looking at monolithic architecture, but it's kind of a micro front-end architecture. If you see, we are getting an API calls and all. But what if we divide those API calls to different servers? Like, is there a way to make these all configurable? Like, around 50% of the calls will be coming up from this server, or 50% of the calls will be coming from other servers. So something like that is possible. Like, if we see in Angular framework, we have a lazy loaded module which definitely loads another JS file, gives a get request, another get request for loading those files, right? So those can be configured, but if their capability is not there in Angular, if we see, look into that direction. So can we have something like that planned into this?
Mm-hmm. Broadly speaking, I think the question is, sorry, I apologize if I missed some of this stuff because it was kind of hard to understand that the quality is not the best. But broadly speaking, the question is around micro front ends. So when fetching data, you can, you're basically in control of your own stuff and you can do anything like that you want. Like there's nothing specific in Qwik that talks about data fetching. However, Qwik does have a micro front end thing, which I didn't really talk about, but I think it is super cool. So let me reshare my screen again. By the way, I have a hard stop in 10 minutes at 1 o'clock my time. So
You're coming back. Don't worry.
Heads up that I will disappear. So here's our homepage. And what's cool about this is that this homepage, this is part of the Qwik City application, this banner on the top. But the content over here is actually part of Builder. And so let me see if I can have a Builder. Builder. I can load this inside of Builder.io. And I can actually edit this particular page. I'll show you. So this is what Builder does, right? This is what pays my bills, so to speak. And you'll see that this is editable inside of here. And so this is also a Qwik application. So Builder produces what goes in here, and then Qwik City produces what goes on the top. And so what you see here is that there's actually two containers. There's the top level application that's running here, and inside of it is a second application. And notice that the top level application comes out of /build, but the inner application actually comes from a completely different server. And so these two applications, while they work seamlessly on the page, they actually are coming from separate locations. They're separate deployments. They're separate, they're not even running the same version. Like this thing still is running version 21, and this thing is running version 3.0. And they just work together. So we haven't talked about micro front ends, but actually Qwik has an amazing micro front end story and an amazing personalization story. And the reason why it's amazing is because it starts with this HTML first attitude. And that attitude turns out to makes all the difference in how things kind of work.
Crazy, crazy stuff. Okay.
There's just a follow-up question. Like we are always suggested to have reduced get requests, right, from the server, so that the load at the server is not too much. So, so like right now we see that too many JS are being pulled from the server. So, like, how do you suggest that this is a more optimized way? And like, see if you see Netflix and all, they have to put load balancers at their website because for the get request for each and every minute. And so same kind of a similar kind of thing can be seen in this also. Right.
Right. So but you're getting that, right? Like if you look at the number of requests that this page is actually making, a huge number of requests never happen, right? Because it comes in as a single HTML from a CDN, and the JavaScript gets greatly reduced, and then nothing executes. And because the application doesn't have to wake up, it doesn't have to go through I'm waking up and I'm making all these requests back to the server that the server just inlined in there anyways. So when you actually look at what's actually happening from the application, you actually see that this idea of resumability is actually a huge plus for the amount of requests you make to the server. But to make it clear, like on the end of the day, Qwik isn't responsible for your request to the server in the sense of like your API. It's only responsible for the static resources. And Qwik does an amazing job to like minimize the number of resources, static resources that needs to be sent to the client. For your JSON data, for your actual application data, that's up to you. Like you need to figure out a way to do that. that it's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one? Because we got Sonder. I want Sonder to have like.
Yeah, one
Sonder's
question.
got
And then,
good questions. Real quick, Sonder. You're muted though.
Oh, okay. I really like the whole idea behind Qwik, and I'm going to build another version of something. I did build it a couple of months ago, but if I look at it now, it has matured a lot in this time. And then I will probably have better questions than I do have now. I'm a little bit concerned about the amount of requests, but as they are all very small, that might not be a big problem.
It's either that or one massive request in the beginning, which is what we're doing now. Like
there is a middle ground there.
So just to be clear, like the amount of requests you currently see is we don't have yet implemented this idea of coalescing and using statistical information to kind of optimize this stuff, right? You can see how it's easy to do because we have all the right stuff. It's just that particular thing is not on a priority because it turns out that if you have HTTP2 and you have all these prefetching, like it's the same connection. So you just keep getting it. So it's not actually that much of a difference in practice.
No, but there is still overhead. So there is.
Yeah, there's overhead. Yeah.
So that is my concern, and also it's such a different paradigm to work in that it might be hard for to get a team together that is able to work with this stuff.
Not if Shai trains them.
Yeah, but Shai needs to finish his stuff first, so.
Well, he'll get there. Yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah, he will get there. So yeah, but it's still a little bit early days, and at the same time, I really like this because it will optimize a lot of things if you want to sell something on the web. I still feel that for internal or business-to-business applications, the extra effort. Well, your application will be more performant, but the team will be slower because everything is new and everything needs to be reinvented.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have an existing team that already knows certain things, you might roll out things a lot quicker without Qwik.
That's why I said that the engine will be the search engine facing application first, and once the API will get stabilized, once like everybody will move to this new greener frameworks who downloads much less JavaScript and more for sustainability sake, right? For the future of mankind. Okay, that's everybody else will like move to the next generation. Just like the same argument was with like PHP and ASP.NET, right? And then everybody moved to AngularJS. So we're looking here at a glimpse at the future, and not just like.
That brings me to another question.
No,
How easy is it to upgrade my AngularJS application to this?
Come on, they're coming back, and I have to close this out because everybody's leaving, and we have 3 minutes. Okay, so obviously, Misko is coming back. This was just the first conversation. We will have more conversations. So if you're watching this on YouTube later, subscribe. Better yet, join the freaking channel so that you can be here with us and ask these amazing questions. We're going to have more discussions. It's going to be great. And we have just enough time for our tradition. You know the tradition, everybody. Come off mute and help me thank our guests. We love you guys. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you, Misko.
Thank you, Misko.
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you so much.
You did great work there.
And follow Qwik's Twitter account and also my account to hear more news about the upcoming stuff. And Misko also.
Just subscribe to the Twitter account.
Subscribe to everybody, follow everybody, join the experts channel. We'll be here again. And as soon as we leave here, I'm going to email Misko a link so that he can pick another date and come right back in a month or two and answer more questions. So in the meantime, you guys need to go try it out and play with it and actually put your hands on it and mess with it, and then come back and we'll talk more.
And tell your friends just how amazing it is.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.